Hi, Rich Hoffman here. So there's a lot been said about Mel Gibson's appearance on Joe Rogan. I think Mel Gibson's much more. I've always liked Mel Gibson. I think he's a really good guy. I think he's a great filmmaker, and I can't wait to see his new movie, the sequel to The Passion of the Christ, The Resurrection. That's going to be, I think, wonderful. It's great that President Trump is making him one of the ambassadors to Hollywood to represent the White House and the values and make America great again. Mel Gibson's on the rise. Of course, he's been for the last 20 years. Been castigated because Hollywood wanted to go a different direction, and he's always been kind of a conservative filmmaker. And since he made The Passion of the Christ, he's been ostracized by those who are anti-God heathens that finance and run Hollywood. So Mel Gibson's been on his way out for a long time. We haven't heard much from him. He was hot stuff in the 90s for people who were around back then. And after Passion of the Christ, he was removed pretty much from Hollywood. They found every way they could to get rid of him. So it's been a long journey for Mel Gibson. So now all of a sudden he's back in the news, got some good projects going on. Making some good movies, but nothing like this the second Passion movie that he's going to come out, The Resurrection. That's going to be fantastic. But Mel Gibson, I think, has had he's lived a hard life. I think for people like him, religion is the rock you hang on to kind of get yourself through it when you make a lot of mistakes in life, and he's made a lot of mistakes in life. So he believes in kind of the time scale that is indicated in the Bible. I don't know that the Bible puts it out there in ways from the creation of the earth to the time that Adam and Eve come along and Abraham comes along. Sometimes I think the years get off, but he's one that believes that the history of the earth is 6,000 years old. And Ken Ham down at the Ark Encounter has the same kind of thoughts about things. And of course, anybody that knows me, I think human beings have been around for millions of years. And the modern society and the technological advances we have are tens of thousands of years old, probably going back to pre-Ice Age, and we've seen through the Vico cycle over and over and over again, rising and falling of human civilization. And I think that the span chronicled in most of the Bible is the last 6,000 years or 7,000 years is just one of them. I think we've seen many cycles. So Mel Gibson's not quite ready to accept that, and I don't blame people who aren't. I respect their commitment to religious ideology. I think Ken Ham down in when he does the arguments with Bill Nye the Science Guy, I love his conviction. I like those kinds of people. I like Ken Ham a lot. I like the Ark Encounter. I like the Creation Museum in Cincinnati. These are good people, but I don't agree with their time scale. But doesn't matter because the values are more important than the details, as far as I'm concerned. Well, when it comes to defending, though, an assumption, like, do you believe Earth is only, how many, 6,000, 10,000 years old? And then how do you justify that? So one of the big debates between those like me who think that civilization's been around for a very long time, I think, because I've seen it, and most notably in Japan. When I've been to Japan, there's quite obviously a very ancient technology at work. I mean, you see it in the pyramids, you see it all over Central America. Through LiDAR, we're finding cities, ancient cities, many well into the BCs. These were not hunter and gatherers who migrated into city-states the way that we've assumed they were. These are cultures that were advanced. They started advanced, and they obviously went back way into time and pre-Ice Age, obviously. So the debate is always to find some way to explain away things that are very old and explain that they were part of this current timeline. And I think you can't do that because there's just too many overlapping elements, and I think what you're seeing more can be explained by a Vico cycle than corresponding chronologies. Like in Ken Ham's case, when you go to the Ark Encounter in Kentucky, just outside Cincinnati, you have dinosaurs on the ark, because we know dinosaurs existed. We see their bones or in museums. Were they millions of years old, or are they thousands of years old? And I think in Ken Ham's case, you got to acknowledge they exist. So you put them on the ark with all the other animals, because they went extinct over the last couple thousand years, but they were around back then. And that's one way to try and reconcile a timeline. I think what you got to do is accommodate the Vico cycle and understand that life forms, whether it's dinosaurs, whether it's human beings, degrees of human beings, whether they're people who migrated from Mars and landed here and rose and fell and died away, and Neanderthals became part of that culture, and all kinds of things happen. I think you need a much broader brush to paint the story than trying to squeeze it into a previous assumption, whether it's biblical or whether it's scientific. I don't see why you have to have differences. You can have biblical scientific research. One of my favorite periodicals, my favorite magazines in the world, is Biblical Archaeology Review, where you take science and apply it to biblical understanding, biblical stories, biblical narrative that you have chronicled in a piece of literature. The Word of God. That it's a fascinating exchange, but you always have to understand that you're always looking for new information and accommodating that to a narrative that makes sense. But that narrative might change based on new evidence. So one of the debates that came up on Joe Rogan that Mel Gibson pointed out that I thought was very interesting, because again, with me, and going back to the Japanese culture and all around India, the Indus Valley culture, all around that region, sea levels were 400 feet less during the Ice Age. And if you go off and dive in these areas, there's been a lot of good chronology done there, that the sea levels, there's a lot of civilization that's under the water, because that was the previous ocean fronts. And when the ocean levels rose, all those cities were buried. And there's probably more ancient cities buried off the coasts of major continents than anybody's previously understood. And we're just trying to understand, like the Garden of Eden, where it's at, previous civilizations that existed tens of thousands of years ago. Reason you don't see them everywhere is because they're buried underwater. So then Mel Gibson brought up, well, if you ever put a piece of ice in a glass of water, it doesn't really displace it. When the ice melts, it doesn't displace the water. So you put the ice in the water and the ice melts, you still have the same volume of water. It doesn't spill out over the edge of the glass. So I thought that was an interesting thing to say, and he's a smart guy. Well, here's the problem. Well, during the Ice Age, and I don't think a lot of people understand how many miles high some of these glaciers were. But the the water of the world was over these continents. A lot of people don't understand that the Great Lakes were formed by the remnants of the glaciers. They weren't there forever. They're only 10,000 some years old. And the weight of the ice pushed down the crust of the earth in that spot. So even now, the earth is coming back to a circumference and pushing that water back out to the Atlantic. Eventually, those Great Lakes in America won't even be there. It'll be flat areas. So a lot of that ice that was over land masses all over both poles was migrating, and when you had it melt, when it melted away, that water had to go somewhere. And that's the difference, because the argument is, well, did we actually have lower sea levels? Do we have continuous sea level changes? And the answer is yes. And in this case, that's where you get the 400 feet less at that time during the Ice Age, and you had all these coastlines all over the world that were oceanfront property. But when those glaciers melted, the water that was over land masses ran into the seas, and the water levels increased by 400 feet. And it's hard for people to get their mind wrapped around how much water that is. But when you consider many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of miles of water, mile high, all over the ice caps going down over the continents, and it melts, of course, that water's got to go somewhere, and it goes to the lowest points of the earth, and that's where our current oceans are. But when they were over land masses, that water was displaced. It was not in the oceans. So the idea that you can put an ice cube in a glass of water goes away because you have mass that wasn't there to begin with that is suddenly there. When these glaciers melted, the water went to the lower points and filled up the oceans 400 feet higher. So that's how a lot of these ancient civilizations got buried, and it comes up with this assumption of, well, how advanced were people in a time when no one understood what they were, because we assumed that during the Ice Age we just had some cave painters in France that were just making some rudimentary ideas about the hunt, chasing down some deer. Now you had people actually building cities and had a very advanced understanding of astronomy, and had a religion of astrology that permeated their cultures and was radiated in their artwork everywhere. And we just are starting to scratch the surface on this stuff, and the only reason that's happening is because it's taken us 100 years to kind of figure out where we were, and that a lot of that stuff is off the coast and not actually on solid land as we know it today, because those were well inland from where they used to be when the ocean levels were much lower. But when smart people like Mel Gibson are, kind of not quite in sync with mass displacement and how ice is put in a glass and how that mass changes, whether it's in a melted state or a solid state, the reason the ocean levels rose or rescinded at different points in history is because ice water was capturing these glaciers by the miles in depth, and they were over large parts of the earth as far as mass goes, and that the water wasn't in the lowlands, it was stuck in these giant glaciers. And people who don't really understand very well Ice Age geology might have a hard time if you're thinking about mass displacement being the difference between a melted state and a solid state, when it's really a difference in location of where that water is stored. So most of the water of the world was outside the glass, not in it. So it didn't matter if it was solid or a liquid. In whatever state it existed in, it wouldn't have mattered, because it had to go from one place to another, and that's where the ocean levels changed. And that's why a lot of that stuff is buried. So to kind of hide the fact that there's a reality that could shake up our belief system, that those ancient civilizations off the coast of most of our land masses that are buried under a lot of water, most of the Persian Gulf was above water at that time. So there's a lot of civilization under the Persian Gulf that would make more sense when you start looking at mythology and the remnants of the stories that were told at that period of time and captured in great literary texts, like the Bible. But the depth of history is way beyond what we've previously been able to understand. And when we use defense mechanisms like water displacement to explain a way that we shouldn't even look because science doesn't point in that direction, it's more for ourselves to protect an assumption than the adventure of science and what it brings us that we might not yet have discovered. And that's where the real answers are. And that's why it's important to understand that we have a lot to learn off the coasts of our countries, cities that have been long buried, that we have yet to discover. And we have to admit to ourselves that what we do learn is probably going to change a lot of what we believe. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. Anyway, it's Rich Hoffman here. Share, subscribe, make tomorrow a better day. If you ever read my book, The Gunfighter's Guide to Business, I think you'll love it. Anyway, have a good day. See you later.